I know you're all eager to get started, so without further ado, I would like to introduce your chairman, Amaury Jr., co-founder and chief investment officer of Vision Brasil Investments.
Eu sei que vocês querem começar, então, sem aguardar mais, eu gostaria de apresentar o presidente do dia, Amaury Jr., cofundador e diretor de investimentos de Vision Brasil Investments. Aplauso.
So good morning, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here. As a matter of fact, the fourth year I'm here as a chairperson of the conference, so it's a long time. In particular, witnessed many interesting changes. I mean, the first conference we had was basically during the day that Brazil received the investment grade. So in the morning session, we were discussing if Brazil could get the investment grade. In the afternoon, we had the investment grade. So it was a very challenging moment and a very interesting moment seeing that those discussions happening and materializing. Now, said that, the content of my sort of brief presentation is really to tackle something that I think is very dear to Brazil, which is the fact that Brazil has something that's related to natural resources that's quite important. It's a big differential that Brazil has. It's going to be relatively brief, but I think it's important because that sort of reaches some areas that I think are quite interesting to discuss in relation to consumer spending and consumer habits in Brazil as well. Key thing that we have right now, and it's the big thing that's happening really in the world, is this emergence of middle class on a global basis. Just to put in a sort of like a blunt manner in here, China is expected that within the next 15 years to have about 350 million people moving from basically misery and poverty into middle class. So what that stands for is that we're going to have a whole new United States being developed in 15 years. So when you look at that, combined with the same type of movement that we see in Indonesia and in India, in the Middle East, in Brazil and elsewhere, it's clear to us that we go into sort of a constraint of natural resources. And what I mean by that is like one, which I think that is the most important one, which is water, and then as a sequence of that, which is like fiber, food, and energy. So all of those, I think we're going to continue to see tremendous pressure in terms of like supply and issues of like volatility in relation to the commodities. Now, said that, as the population is growing, we're seeing nowadays that from the demand side, there's an increase meaning a new variable that was not taken into account when we think in terms of natural resources in the agricultural sector, which is a commingle of natural resources for food and feed, which means human consumption and animal consumption, together with like energy, which is fuel. So we did not have fuel into the equation 10 years ago, in essence, and nowadays we have a new variable that puts even further pressure in natural resources. Combined to that, we have sort of like an equation here that doesn't properly close. Why is that? Because if you look at this graph on your left in here at the presentation here, what's telling us in essence is that we have had a decrease in improvements of yield of agricultural commodities, in particular, like in this case, grains, that has consistently occurred between the 60s and now. In the 60s, we had a tremendous expansion of agricultural production on a global basis. And nowadays, despite the fact that certain countries, such as Brazil and the US, continue to improve on productivity terms, we have depletion of natural resources going on in the world. Many areas that were producing in the past, they don't produce anymore. The contamination that we see prevalent in China and other countries. And as a consequence, nowadays, when we look at in here it's difficult to point out, but anyways, when we look at nowadays, we are going below demographic growth in terms of improvement in yields in grains. So grains production is increasing, but it's increasing at a pace that's slower than demographic growth. So what makes this equation really sort of like, I would say, dangerous is the graph in the right. It's a study of 25 years conducted by McKinsey and some think tank institute in China about household consumption in the country. And if you look at what's the most concerning issue in here is that there was a reduction of consumption of grains proportionally by per capita basis. But this consumption, as a matter of fact, meant that grains were moved to animals, to feed the animals. So animals were basically taking this intake of grain decrease from humans, and a substantial increase in high-end protein consumption, pork, meat, etc. What does that mean? Is that we know that now from the supply side we have less supply because the productivity is decreasing, but in the demand side we have a sort of like a leverage effect on the demand. Why is that? Because for you to produce 1 kilogram of poultry, it requires about 2 kilograms of grains. To produce 1 kilogram of pork, about 4 kilograms of grains, and to produce red meat, about 10 kilograms of grains. So what we are getting into in terms of natural resources, it's really an equation that doesn't close, because we have to think about the fact that when we have not only population expansion, but we also have the fact that population migrates to better protein content on their diet, and consequently also consumption of water, consumption of fiber, and so on. So said that, it comes the issue of Brazil. Brazil has a sort of a uniqueness in regards to natural resources. And what's one of the things that goes into that? A perception, and I think that is a perception that almost everybody has that's not Brazilian, even sometimes the Brazilians have the perception that Brazil is highly dependent on exports of commodities. The reality is it's an important component of our economy, but Brazil is the most insular emerging market country. So this is a data from 2008, and even nowadays it's even lower. If you look in this graph in here, we sum exports and imports and divide by GDP. So on a sum of exports plus imports divided by GDP, which is the content of like international trade in regards to the economy in Brazil, we see that Brazil is the country that is the most insular among emerging markets. As a matter of fact, I mean, India is perceived to be an insular country. Brazil is twice as insular as India, if you would say that. Nowadays, this number is in the order of 20%, is even lower than what was in 2008. What does that mean? Is that Brazilian economy is really much more dependent on its internal market than it is to the external market, which is a kind of sort of like a weird thing to think about, because as we think about Brazil, we think on a sort of external point of view, we think about Brazil as being a major commodity exporter and consequently highly dependent on the commodities. But the reality is that the Brazilian economy grows in regards to the internal market. So the internal market is really important. Now, said that, when we go into natural resources, it's very important to think about that Brazil, half of the Brazilian territory is the Amazonian territory. And in the past, we have made efforts to preserve the Amazonia, but the reality now is that these efforts are now taking really a real place. Nowadays, we have situations that in one day the federal police shut down all the sawmills in the state of Pará, 64 sawmills in one day, and only allowed to go back to operation the ones that were really doing in sustainable manner, the processing of wood in sustainable manner. So it's not only on paper, but it's really happening on a real basis. So this is really developing. Why this is important? Because there is an area that's basically below the Amazonia, the biome that's below the Amazonia, which is the Cerrado, which is fundamental for agriculture, not only for Brazil, but to the world, as Brazil is really the plug-in expansion area of the world in terms of agricultural production, as we will see next. So what are the key advantages of Brazil? Brazil still has the largest repository of land in the world, by far. The second place will be Russia, with about a third of land available for expansion. Very important here. There are countries with more arable land in place, but in terms of expansion, or meaning areas to expand, Brazil is the one that has the largest amount of non-developed arable land in place. Second, which is the most important point in our equation here, is water. Brazil has the largest repository of renewable water in the world, which is fundamental for agriculture and for many other activities, human activities. We nowadays have a very strict environmental code. Just to put in perspective, our code nowadays entices criminal offenses for cutting a tree or killing an animal, which is probably one of the most, I would say, stringent codes on a global basis. And this is enforceable. I mean, it's enforced. I think this is very important because that allows us to preserve sort of like a source of water for us, which is the Amazonia. And I think that this will allow us to continue to grow in the agricultural sector as an important player. The other part that I think is very important is the issue of corporate farming. Brazil scale is very large. For the sake of comparison, in the US, a large property would be in the range of about 2,000 acres for production. In Brazil, a large property for production is in the range of 50,000 to 100,000 acres. We work a lot in agriculture, and that's the size areas that we develop and we work on production. So it's quite substantial, the scalability, and consequently the reduction of fixed costs when you do that type of agriculture. Then a point that's also very important in our equation is the issue of technology. Brazil has developed in the course of years through Embrapa, which is a local sort of agency, the government sponsored, an amazing array of like genetic improvements, strain improvements in agricultural products, and by far is really nowadays the leader in tropical technology on a global basis, where in many cases Brazil has the highest productivity for many commodities, which were not in the past, about 10 years ago, we were not even in the ranks of production. So this has been the payoff of about 30 years of investment from the government in terms of putting together research in the agro sector. And lastly, something that's not very well known, but I think it's very important to point out in here, Brazil is the only large latitudinal player in agriculture in the world. What do I mean by that? We're skipping here just 1 second. Go back for that before we go into the latitudinal issue. In terms of ranking, just to put in perspective, Brazil is already ranked number 1 in production and exports of several commodities like coffee beans, sugar, among some of them. In the case of soybeans, number two, but becoming number 1 within like a 5 to 10 year time frame. Beef, number 2 producer, number 1 exporter. So if you see there's a large rank. But more important than the rank is the fact that Brazil now penetrates on a global base more than 180 markets, which means phytosanitary barriers in 180 markets. So technology and sort of knowledge has been in place in Brazil to really reach the world on a global basis. Now, when we go now to the point that I mentioned to you at the last point on that sort of slide, is the issue of latitudinal play. Why is this important? This mapping here is not the way that you usually see the world. The way you usually see the world is a Mercator projection, which gives more parallels to the northern hemisphere. In here is equally divided, the southern and northern hemisphere, so the equator passes exactly in the middle of the map, which is different than a Mercator projection, it's a Gall-Peters projection. But when you look at that, what's most important? The southern hemisphere tends to be more stretched, and the northern hemisphere tends to be more, I would say, more stretched, and the one that tends to be more wide in terms of area. What this means is that the bulk of agriculture in the world, which is conducted in the Midwest US, in Europe, Ukraine, Russia, and China, occurs in a very narrow parallel range. So the parallels or latitude parallels that we're talking about is very narrow. What does that mean? With global climatic problems going on, volatility is much higher because when we have climatic problems happening, they impact most of the areas at the same time. We're having exactly this problem this year we had last year. Last year was Russia droughts and problems in Europe. This year we're having the same problems of drought for wheat for the US, for Europe, for Russia, and for China at the same time. So no wonder why this is an issue that will continue to be a key issue in terms of like reduction of, I would say, stocks of agricultural commodities. Because the bulk of production of commodities, they come from areas that are very similar in weather patterns. In contrast to that, Brazil, being located in the southern hemisphere, is very wide, very large in terms of latitude range, so we don't have as much longitudinal range, but latitudinal range. And we have agriculture that goes from equatorial to subtropical or temperate climate. The south of Brazil has the same problems that you would see elsewhere. The south of Brazil is impacted by El Niño, La Niña, which are weather patterns, which sometimes provide breakage of productions in Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and south of Brazil. But the big difference that Brazil has is really this peripheral region that's called the Cerrado, which is a savanna-type vegetation that goes below the Amazonia, which is highly protected by the Amazonia biome. And consequently, is a necessity for us to protect the environment in the Amazonia, which allows us to preserve the water, which will allow us to continue to be a large agricultural producer. In terms of like putting numbers, these are the numbers for Brazil in terms of like the amount of land available. Part of that is also coming from pasture conversion. And important in there, the price of land in Brazil, on average, is a third of the price of land in Argentina and the US. In here, when you look at this graph, U.S. and Argentina are pretty much, I would say, agricultural land, no? Just to make a point in here. And also would be, I would say, slightly more expensive than Russia, but Russia has different issues which relates to land possession, land development, and political issues as well. Now, in regards to water, Brazil has an amazing amount of water rainfall, what we call pluviometric indexing here. Only one part of Brazil is a little dry, which is called the Caatinga biome, but the remainder of the country receives more than 1,200 millimeters of water per year, which is a substantial amount of water on a countrywide basis. As a consequence of that, we are the largest sort of like repository of water in the world. By far, for instance, just as an example, Canada is perceived to be a large content of water, but both Canada and Russia, the bulk of water is in frozen manner, so you don't really have them readily available. The water that's in Brazil is readily available, and consequently, what you see in that is that Brazil is reaching now the peaks in terms of productivity in many commodities. Soybeans nowadays, we have surpassed the U.S. On average in the country, we're talking about 2.92 tons per hectare of production, which is now already above the U.S. as an average in the country. In cotton, we are already the highest productivity country in the world. And very important, in fiber, in this case we're talking about eucalyptus, we have the shortest cycle of production of eucalyptus in the world. This is part, of course, due to natural resources, but a lot of it is related to technology improvements. Just to give an example, we do it later in the case of eucalyptus, a little bit later. But in here, it's just productivity gains in Brazil. We're talking about, on average, the last 20 years, productivity improves in the range of 4%. Producing area has increased very little. We see that the production area in Brazil, a hectare basis, has increased on a pace of about 1% per annum. On the other hand, when we look at production has increased at a pace of 5% per annum. So it's a substantial productivity improvement in the course of 20 years that have been developing. And part of that is due to this. I mean, on large-scale agriculture, in the areas that you don't require irrigation, and we're talking here about without irrigation, very important in here. So what we see here, harvesting of one commodity, in this case soybeans, and immediately sowing another commodity, in this case corn, but most important, with very little environmental damage, because as the crop is being harvested, immediately after that, you have the organic matter left over in the soil, and that matter is used, as a matter of fact, as organic matter for the development of the second harvest. This is very interesting because this allows extreme gains in productivity for the same hectare that is under production. You're not using energy, you're not using irrigation, you're just benefiting from the weather conditions, which in this case the Cerrado benefits from being sub-Amazonian, so there's very good weather patterns, and it's still buffered from weather patterns that we see in the south of Brazil because Amazonia allows its own weather patterns, and consequently the scalability is a key issue in there. And very important, very little subsidies. The bulk of agriculture in Brazil is conducted with self-investments or sort of fund investments, individual investments, or the producers reinvesting their money, as well as bartering provided by trading companies, etc., but very little finance. Okay? So just to finalize in here, and we put in here the context of like consumer, a very interesting equation here. This is how much kilograms per capita per sort of year we have of consumption in the world. The developed world has a range of about 200 kilograms per capita. Brazil is in the range of 40, and China in the lower range 25, and India in the range of 5. What does that mean? As middle class is improving, we will see tremendous demands for fiber because it means packaged goods. It means also something that's absolutely important, which may look ridiculous, but toilet paper consumption is increasing substantially on a global basis. Why? Because there's a strong migration of individuals coming from the countryside in China, in India, going to urban centers, where they require packaged goods, they require toilet papers, they require tissues, etc., etc. So this type of things, I think, are very important to point out. And Brazil, over time, is nowadays the country where wood grows faster. So just to give you an idea, and if we look at in terms of timing, and that's just to finalize the presentation, in the 90s, Brazil had an average growth rate of about 25 cubic meters per hectare per year. Nowadays, it's 41. Why is that? The environmental conditions have not changed. This was technology that was developed which permits that. And when we look at that from an economic standpoint, nowadays, more than 60% of the pulp and paper projects, projects in the world are located in Brazil. The new projects are relocating to Brazil. Why? Because Brazil offers a much more competitive growth environment for agriculture, and consequently, on the industrial basis, it's also developing due to this natural resources advantage. So that I wanted just to give this sort of like general brief, because I think that there are perceptions about Brazil that are not well clear in terms of like where Brazil stands in regards to I would say the issue of like natural resources in terms of the economy, and the importance of that in the long run. I think that is a very important issue in the area. Now to switch now, I just finalized my presentation. I would like to introduce Ilan Goldfajn. Ilan is the chief economist of Itau and a partner of Itau BBA. He's an accomplished individual. He was also governor of the Brazilian Central Bank. He have had several sort of like functions in terms of asset management and even in governmental agencies during his career. He has a PhD from MIT and degrees from the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. So Ilan, please welcome you here. Okay.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Good morning for everybody. Very nice to see all of you here in the morning, São Paulo morning. It was a very nice presentation about the agriculture in Brazil. My presentation today is about Brazil. What are the potentials? What are the issues? I'm going to talk about the new consumer, the middle class, and also about the challenges ahead. We at Itau Unibanco will have a long-term growth model. We have also forecasts for Brazil, both for the consumers and for income growth in Brazil. So there you go. I think we have the presentation already here. So Brazil beyond 2011. Why beyond 2011? We tend to concentrate a lot about the short-term effects. For example, as you know, there's a lot of debate about Brazil. Is Brazil overheating? The answer is yes. But it's also the answer that it's moderating. Is Brazil facing an inflation problem? Yes. But we believe it will, with the moderation, it will slowly become less of a problem. Is Brazil a bubble? I don't think so. I hope you don't think so. You're sitting down here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the paths ahead, the trends. So my talk today, and now it's working, I'm going to talk to you about the new middle class and the issue that was said before about the strength of the domestic demand. I'm going to talk to you about this long-term model we have, the Brazil, we call it Brazil 2020, which is long-term growth, an investment boom, and external financing. So it looks like we're going to have a lot of issues, a lot of foreign direct investment. The third point, which a lot of investors are concerned, is the issue of appreciation. We're going to talk about the causes and what is our forecast for the near term, 2001, and especially beyond 2001. And after I said the three main issues, I'm going to talk about what's next. What's next has to be regarding the challenges ahead. It's not going to be, even though Brazil is not a bubble, there are a lot of challenges that need to be addressed in order to grow sustainable in the next decade or more. So here is what's happening in the last few years. And a few years, I mean, we're talking about from 2001 to, for example, 2009, the latest numbers we have there. And you see the first bar is the growth of the 10% poorest in Brazil. What type of growth? Income growth. And the lower bar is the growth of the 10% richest individuals in Brazil. And you see that for some reason, the growth of the 10% poorer had a Chinese growth, while the growth of the 10% richest had, let's say a Japanese growth. So at the end of the day, what the conclusion is that the coefficient of Gini, which is a coefficient that measures how much well distributed is the income. And the lower the graph, the lower the line, the better is the distribution. It had a major change from 2001 to 2009, and has the latest data come. We also know it has continued in 2010 and 2011. And what is the consequence of an economy that has been growing at around 4% with income being distributed in this way? The consequence is that you are creating a middle class. And why are you creating a middle class? People will say, well, because you have transfers, the famous Bolsa Familia, which is a transfer from the government to the poorest, but that explains only 15% of the distribution. The bulk of the distribution has improved because of the improvement in labor income. For some reason, the labor income of the poor, because the economy has been growing, because you need more employers, because unemployment is now in the record low, the income of the poor have increased much higher than the rich. So at the end of the day, when you look at the brackets, and here I divide the income by brackets, we have the bracket A, which is the ones that consume more, then you have the bracket B, then you have the bracket C. When we talk about the middle class, we're talking about bracket C on, which means bracket C, B, and E. What is bracket C in Brazil is calculated as being 1,600, above 1,600 reais per family, per month. Family is average 3 to 4 people. So if you are Brazilian, if your family has 1,600 reais per month, you're considered middle class, and this makes a lot of difference in terms of purchasing power. As you see from the graph in the side, the classes A, B, and C have been growing systematically. And the classes D and E, which were the ones that consume less, has less purchasing power, have decreased systematically. So what does this mean? It means that when you look at the bracket A, B, C, from 2003 to 2009, we have an increase of 26.7 million people. And when we calculate the trends, it means that we're going to have another almost 28 million people incorporated to the middle class. So what I've shown you in this graph is really a transformation of the Brazilian economy. The previous presentation shows the strength of our commodity-based, of where we have comparative advantage, of our exports. This is showing you why is this domestic demand, the own dynamic of Brazil comes from its own resources, which is growth in income or growth in consumers. At the end of the day, even in 2014, you will still have around 50 million people to incorporate. So what I'm telling you is that over the last few years, we had millions of people incorporated in the middle class. We're going to continue to have them in the next few years. And this has changed the environment of businesses. Businesses are now looking different about the demand, who they're looking for, how much they need to produce, and especially how much they need to invest. So, when you look at investments, Brazil has been, when you compare Brazil in terms of investments, and you look at China, for example, India, other emerging markets, Brazil has lacked exactly what I just mentioned. We need to invest more. And the reason you don't invest is that usually investment and savings are related. You refrain from consuming, you save the money, you put it in the bank, there is intermediation, this money goes to investment and the country invests more. What happens in Brazil is that savings is low. Well, maybe as low as the US. But what's going to happen now is that investment will and is increasing in Brazil. So when we look at investment, over the next 9 years, 10 years, 2011, to 2020, what you see is that investment will have to pick up a little bit. So today, investment is around 18% of GDP, and it looks like we're going all the way to 22-23% of GDP. This may look like small compared to China, but compared to Brazil, it means another 4 to 5% of GDP. Major change. And the question is, why do we believe investment will have an investment boom? It's already contracted. It's there. If I give you the list of reasons why we believe investment will increase, you'll probably agree with us. First, pre-salt. Major investment to take the oil out of the pre-salt. Second, infrastructure. Third, real estate is booming. Fourth, we need investments for the World Cup. 5, we need investments for the Olympics. When you do 6, I just show you how many new consumers you have. You need a lot of investment to satisfy the demand. So when you join everything, demand for investment is there. Projects are there. People are taking their projects out. The question is not whether people want to invest. The question is, will the country have the resources, the financing to do that? And the answer we have is that partly will be through more domestic savings, resources here, but mostly will be through foreign financing. Capital inflows for direct investment, for debt flows, for equity flows. That will be the way Brazil will probably have to finance. Is this the only way? No. You could probably have a major reforms that will increase domestic savings, but it looks like they're not going to be there in the near future. So probably the financing will and is coming from foreign sources. And part of it will be FDI, as you see. We'll have a deficit in the current account, so we will import more than we export. And part of it will be financed by the FDI, the other part will be financed by other type of flows. And so I told you about the middle class, consumption. That means more investment. This investment means more need for more financing. The financing will come from abroad. This has consequences. One of the consequences is that the real is appreciating. So my third topic today is what's happening with the currency. As you probably realize, when you have your dinner or lunch, or you're going to have your dinner or lunch in São Paulo, it's one of the most expensive cities today. So the currency is expensive. And what are the reasons? One of the reasons is not the real, is the dollar. I've shown you here the real, which is the thick line. I chose 4 other currencies. All of them are appreciating. Why is that? It's because one currency is depreciating, not because all of them are appreciating. Is the dollar is depreciating. The dollar needs to depreciate because of the current account debt, because of the adjustment the U.S. needs to do, and because the global economy needs the surplus countries to diminish their surplus and the deficit countries to diminish the deficit. And as a consequence, we need a dollar which is weaker. Not only the U.S. needs, but the global economy needs. But the consequence is that everybody suffers an appreciation. In the past, appreciation will not be associated with suffer. But today, appreciation is suffering. In the past, suffering was associated with huge depreciations, huge crisis. Now, it's the other way around. If you appreciate too much, it's a problem. One of the reasons to appreciate too much is that the dollar is losing its value. The second reason is, has Brazil exports, and here is the commodities. This is an index we created just to show you what are the commodities that are relevant to Brazil. It's Itau Commodity Index for exports, means that look at the commodities globally, look at what are the effects on Brazil, and see what's the effect when these commodity prices go up, what is the effect on your currency. As you see, the 2 lines are basically moved together. So one of the reasons why the real is appreciated, because the real is seen as a commodity currency. As commodities become more expensive, as they go up, the real appreciates. So first reason, dollar weakness. Second reason, commodity strength. And the third reason I just told you, which was the fact that we need foreign savings, capital inflow come to the country, and the consequence is what you're seeing there, is that the exchange rate has appreciated. Of course, during the crisis, it went back to 220, but as you see, our forecast for the near future is that the currency will remain around where it is. And capital inflows over time, not only until 2012, as you see there, but over time, will probably keep the exchange rate in an appreciated level. We don't believe that you need more than that appreciation. I think you're not going to get more appreciation. It's already appreciated. So it looks like you'll have to live with a currency which is at current levels for some time. So what are the challenges? My fourth point. What are the challenges? The challenge is that we need somehow to improve productivity. For the same investment, for the same amount of capital and labor you put, you need to generate more resources. Today in the Brazilian economy, we already have a lack of skilled labor. Ask any entrepreneur, what is his major problem? I need human capital. I need this engineer. I need this architect. The only thing they don't need is more economists like myself. But the rest they need. So basically, what is the issue? Education. Here is the improvement in education when you measure by years of study. And over time, you see the average years of study of the Brazilian has increased. But you need to go further than that. You need to improve the quality. When you look at the exams, and this is the PISA 2009 ranking, here's where Brazil sits. So if you complain about the results in other countries, Brazil has really to improve education. So it's not enough to put the kids in school. They are there. You're putting them there. Now you have to do something with them. You have to teach them. They have to get out of school knowing a little better in order to be able to generate resources, to generate value. Another challenge is governance. I think when you look at some of the rankings, this is the World Bank ranking of ease of doing business. This is the rank 2011. Unfortunately, Brazil is 127. It looks like it's not easy to do business here. When you have to open a business, when you have to close the business, when you have to hire people, when you have to, the red tape, the taxes, everything, it seems that it is hard to do business here. You don't need to do a lot. You don't need in order to improve that, you need to have governance. It's not like investments when in order to have 4 to 5% more investment as a proportion of GDP, you need the resources. It's very hard. This is something that is hard to do, but you don't need really the resources. You need the governance. You need to look at things that do not appear in the eye of for example, the voter, but it appears in the eye of the business. It improves competitiveness. It improves productivity. The last challenge I want to do is that if we lack financing, we need somewhere to save. And one of the places we need somehow to find resources from the public sector, public savings. Because I don't think we're going to have more private savings. So you ask, why not? I just show you that the middle class is exploding. The income is going there. You distribute the income. When you distribute the income, you put money from the rich to the poor is going to spend more than the rich. It's not going to come from consumers, the savings. But it can come from government. But you need reforms. And as you've seen here, the Social Security spending has a size of if you are young or not. So Brazilians, for example, are still relatively young. The scale here shows that the more you go to the right, my right, when you look at it, the older is the population. So Brazil is relatively young, but the Social Security benefits are relatively generous. You need to do a reform. You do a reform, you save resources, if you save resources, you can finance more investment without pressuring your current account, without needing so much flows from abroad. So what did I tell you today? Well, basically 4 points. First, the issue of income distribution is relevant. It has led to a new middle class in a strengthening domestic demand. This is a strength today. In the long term, we expect growth to be around 4%, with higher investment to GDP ratio, 22 to 23% of GDP, financed by foreign capital, foreign savings. Currency appreciation it's here, it's important, but it's here to stay. The reasons are dollar weakness, high commodity prices, and the fact that you need capital flows, and they will be coming and pressuring the currency. And the last point is that the sustainability of this performance requires you to deal with the excesses. One of them I show you is that we need to have a reform in the public sector. Other things are overheating, short term, government spending growth, bottlenecks, and the one that I already mentioned is investment financing. So that's the issue. I think Brazil has a lot to grow. The path is promising. However, you need to deal with some of these challenges. Thank you very much.